The Nun 2 just dropped in theaters today. Technically, it's the 9th installment in the Conjuring universe, unless you're Michael Chaves or Peter Safran, who say that The Curse of La Llorona is technically not part of the CU, even though it features characters from other Annabelle movies. Not really sure what's up with all that. One thing that is for certain, though, is that The Nun 2 is the sequel to the first Nun from 2018. Let's get into a spoiler-free and spoiler review of The Nun 2.
Well, sometimes that is better.
Getting into a non-spoiler review of the film, if you want to skip ahead to the spoiler stuff, that's on the bottom, down here somewhere. While I think The Nun 2 is an improvement upon the first movie, it certainly has a lot of flaws that the first one did not. The first big thing is that Sister Irene is portrayed as a Marvel superhero in this movie. When did this paranormal horror franchise turn into basically a superhero franchise? This movie reminds me a lot of the current state of Marvel, where it's fun while you're watching it, but then after you leave the theater, you can't even remember what you just watched. The climax of this movie renders the entire climax of the previous film as pointless. Volok's powers are super uneven in this film, considering that The Conjuring 2 happened after the events of this movie. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense why the nun is able to do some of the she does here, but she's not able to do that in The Conjuring 2. That's a big problem with prequels these days, and unfortunately The Nun 2 also suffers from that. An improvement upon the first Nun movie is that this film features a globe-trotting side plot, which honestly is more fun, I think, than the previous film, which kind of felt slow and boring at times, but it really muddies things up and tells a very predictable story. And one of my biggest pet peeves about movies, like maybe the #1 thing ever, is when people edit in little scenes from a previous sequence because you might have forgotten about it. I hate when editors think that moviegoers are dumb and that they're gonna forget about something that happened not even 20 minutes ago. This movie does that so many times, and it is so frustrating. A couple things I want to praise about this film, though, is Bonnie Aarons as the nun, as always, is super creepy. The guy that plays Maurice Frenchie's character, I actually think did a really good job in this movie and shined much more than he did even in the first film. His relationship with the character of Sophie is easily one of the strongest things about this entire film. And something I will share with you is that you might want to stay until after the credits, because there's a little something something there for Conjuring fans. Do I recommend seeing this movie in the theaters? What I'll say is that if you're a huge Conjuring fan, you might find some enjoyment out of this film, but it's definitely one of the weaker entries. All right, we're officially getting into spoilers. If you have not seen the movie, don't do that thing where you just watch the spoiler review and then you go watch the movie. That is going to affect your overall enjoyment of this film. You might disagree with everything I just said in the spoiler-free review anyways, and you might want to formulate your own opinion, so don't watch the spoiler review. I know some of y'all do it, and it makes me sad. If you have seen The Nun 2, stick around. The Nun 2 is a bit of an improvement over the first film, but it still goes into those pitfalls of that first movie. It's not as slow and boring, I will give it that. It has a lot of fun little jump scares and character moments, which kept me invested, but overall, it has so many weird inconsistencies that f with other movies. It also had a lot of really boring side characters. I'm sure Storm Reed is a fantastic actress, but her character of Sister Deborah, I just did not care for in this movie. Tessa Farmiga's performance as Sister Irene is also very different from the first movie. Like, there were times where I felt like they were portraying her as a bit like a superhero or whatever. Like, think about that scene in the original Nun where she digs the guy out of the grave like it was nothing in 5 seconds. Like, okay, that's, you know, maybe that's just a weird editing choice, whatever, but in this movie, it's undeniable that she is basically a superhero in a paranormal horror flick. I just feel like these two things don't really mix that well together. I miss the original Conjuring because it's just a simple paranormal possession flick, and as long as you're into that kind of thing, it doesn't really have any crazy big stretches. This movie relies on a lot of suspension of disbelief, too much so to the point that I can't really even enjoy it. And while I think Bonnie Aarons is super creepy in a bunch of the jump scares set up in this movie, she's portrayed as a silent Marvel villain in this movie, and it's just so odd and jarring. Volok is also super overpowered in this movie, selectively. When it's a character that the plot does not need to progress, she immediately kills them. But if it's like Sister Irene, for example, she's just gonna float in the air for like 20 minutes and not do anything. If you really wanted to do a sequel to The Nun, this film should have led directly into the events of what we saw in The Conjuring, where Frenchie's getting the exorcism. This, to me, just feels like a very unnecessary story that didn't really need to be told. Basically, Volok is looking for these eyes, and it will give her powers or something like that, and that's why she has glowing eyes. That is all that this movie contributed to the Conjuring universe in explaining why the nun's eyes glow. So if you're someone who really cares about that, this movie is for you. The most frustrating thing about these magical eyes is that it's so obvious what's going on here. They try to interject this like Indiana Jones plotline. When the sun hits this stained glass window, this like red laser beam or whatever shoots onto the floor right where they're buried in this broken down side of the boarding school. I mean, they totally covered their tracks with it. I'll give them that. Like, the only people that go into this side of the church are the kids when when they're playing, and the whole thing, the game that they have, is that if you look away from the goats, when the light is shining through it, then the devil's gonna show up and kill you. Like, that's like the whole thing. That's why no one has discovered the eyes are down there. Okay, I'll give you that, Nun 2. That's not bad. But the way they set it up and the repetition of talking about eyes, that has got to be in the script 20 times. It's just way too obvious that that is where these things are located, and obviously that's going to be the third act setting. Another weird thing I wanted to note about this film is that the majority of the shots take place in this hallway between like the one side of the boarding school and the other. I just thought that was weird. It's a cool hallway, don't get me wrong, but like the majority of the action in this movie takes place in that one hallway. I don't know who did the location scouting on this movie, but they love a good hallway. I'm sorry if I sound like I'm complaining this whole video, but one last thing, the editing I just also did not care for. Almost every single time something from the past came back to influence the plot, they had to remind us with a certain poignant scene. This just makes me think the editor thinks the audience is stupid, and I get it, this is a PG-13 horror film. You know, the majority of the people coming to this are teenagers who are probably making out with each other instead of actually watching the movie. But what about the people that are here for the plot? You know what I mean? You don't gotta remind us about something that happened not even 20 minutes ago. We just saw that 20 minutes ago. It's quite literally the definition of over-editing. You don't have to do that to progress a story. If you already set it up beforehand, there it is. Now, okay, here's the next part of that. Now, I know you just sat through a lot of the negatives of this film, but does it have some positives? Yes, I think every movie does. The jump scares actually really got me in this movie. Not all of them, but most of them. A trend I've been noticing with Michael Chaves directed Conjuring flicks is that a lot of the jump scares don't land because they don't take enough time to build the tension. But in this movie, that changed. That is a big improvement, in my opinion, upon the Conjuring 3 and The Curse of La Llorona. Unfortunately, a lot of those jump scares were things you've already seen in the trailer though, and that was kind of my biggest problem with it. The big jump scare of the movie is the one in the trailer where Valak like appears in front of all the magazines, and it's set up really well. Like, it's one of the best Conjuring jump scares I think across the board in any of these 9 movies. And yes, I said 9 movies. Curse of La Llorona's in this franchise. Yeah, come on. But genuinely, that's a top 10 jump scare from this franchise because they held you in that tension for just a little longer than you think you should. That's always the best formula for a good jump scare. Think about the jump scare from the original Insidious film. You get Patrick Wilson's mom character to kind of talk a little bit about this creepy dream she had last night about how Dalton's in trouble, and you get to hear this creepy crackling noise that you can associate with the demon you see on screen. Then you hear it again, and then bam, my man's face is right behind old Patty Wills. The setup to that specific jump scare in The Nun 2 was really well done and very similar. You got to see the shape of the nun through the magazine pages or whatever, and then like you're kind of looking around, there's noises everywhere. Then finally, when the light flickers at one point, she jumps out. Bravo on that sequence. That is easily one of the better jump scares in this universe. Although I wasn't crazy about a lot of the characters in this movie, I will say Jonas Bloquet, I don't think that's how you pronounce his name, Bloquet, like a bouquet of flowers, but with an L in there. Jonas kills it in this movie as Frenchie/Maurice. I think he gave an even better performance than his one in the original The Nun. His relationship with Sophie is unbelievably sweet and easily the most compelling aspect to this entire film. And finally, let's talk a little bit about that after the credits sequence, where we get to see Ed and Lorraine Warren again. It is just always so much fun to see Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson on the big screen as their iconic characters. I mean, come on, that's always a good time. There is some very vague setup for The Conjuring 4 that was announced earlier in the year, which leads me to believe that maybe Valak will be back for more. The Nun 3, Valak's back. Oh, that's what we're calling it. Get me Warner Bros on the phone like right now. With all of those criticisms though, I wasn't falling asleep watching this movie like how I was with the first Nun that I watched before I went to the theater to see this. I had a much more fun time with this one than the original Nun, so I gotta give it like a 4 out of 10. I mean, a 4 out of 10 is like not bad. It's just slightly below average. That's not awful. That's not like the worst movie I've ever seen. It's definitely not the worst movie I've ever seen. We all feel differently about movies though, so what did you guys think about The Nun 2? Leave me something about it in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching my The Nun 2 Die Harder review. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more horror content in the future. Please consider supporting me on Patreon as well if you want to see this channel grow. And as always, don't forget to kill it out there, y'all.